Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dig into a story that might just flip what you think you know about one of America's most important intellectual institutions, Old Princeton. The common narrative about its origins, well, it turns out the real story is way more interesting and has roots in a very unexpected place. Okay, so let's kick things off with a question. When you think of Old Princeton, that 19th century powerhouse of traditional Calvinist thought, who do you picture them reading? Who were their biggest influences? And maybe just as important, who were their biggest rivals? For like 100 years, the answer to that question seemed totally settled. The story was that Princeton's entire way of thinking was built on just one thing: Scottish philosophy, also known as common sense realism. And that became the standard go-to explanation you'd find in the history books. But what if that's not even half the story? What if the really crucial conversations that were shaping Princeton weren't happening with Scotland, but way over in the heart of continental Europe? The evidence we're looking at today points to this deep, really intense dialogue with a completely different intellectual world, Germany. So to really get why they were looking to Germany, we have to understand the massive shifts that were happening in the world of ideas back then. I mean, this was an age of incredible intellectual upheaval. Everything was being questioned. The Enlightenment wasn't just some gentle change in thinking, it was a tidal wave. You had rationalism challenging beliefs that had stood for centuries. And in Germany, this radical new approach popped up, treating the Bible not as a sacred text, but just as another historical document you could pick apart. And on top of all that, you have these titanic figures like Kant and Hegel just completely rewriting the rules of philosophy. For the folks over at Princeton, this wasn't some distant academic debate. No, they saw these new ideas as a direct threat to what they called historical Christianity. They knew they couldn't just stick their heads in the sand. They had to build a defense that was every bit as intellectually tough as the attacks coming their way. So the big question is, where did they go to get the intellectual firepower for this defense? Well, surprisingly, they didn't just turn to their Scottish buddies. They went right into the eye of the storm: Germany. And listen, this wasn't just some casual interest. It was a deliberate strategy. It really all starts with this one key figure, Charles Hodge. First, in 1825, he starts a journal specifically to be a bridge for German ideas to get to America. Then he actually goes there himself on what the Germans called a Wanderjahre, basically a wandering year of study, to learn straight from the source. And this pipeline he built, it was massive. We're not just talking about a few articles here and there. Get this, in just the first 4 years of his journal, he introduced American readers to the work of over 100 different German scholars. That's not a trickle, that's a fire hose of new information. And Hodge wasn't some lone wolf. He basically blazed a trail that a who's who of Princeton's best and brightest would follow. This journey to study in Europe became a rite of passage. It was a fundamental part of what it meant to be a top-tier Princeton intellectual. And Hodge was crystal clear about his mission. He flat out said his journal was designed to make all this cutting-edge German research accessible back home. I think he understood a simple truth. You can't really argue against an idea if you don't truly understand it first. Okay, but this is really important. This was not a simple case of them just importing German ideas wholesale. The Princeton scholars were way more like careful engineers than they were passive students. They were incredibly selective, building a very specific intellectual toolkit for a very specific job. This slide just lays their whole strategy bare. It's like they performed a kind of intellectual surgery. They eagerly took the German methods, the how of scholarship, like these new tools for analyzing language. But they fiercely, and I mean fiercely, rejected the radical theological conclusions that a lot of European thinkers were coming to with those exact same methods. So, a key tool they grabbed was something called philology. This was basically a scientific way of understanding language that was perfected in Germany. It let them go deeper than anyone ever had into the original Greek and Hebrew of the Bible, analyzing grammar and word choice with almost forensic precision. And they immediately weaponized these new tools. They used their super deep linguistic analysis to push back hard against European scholars like David Friedrich Strauss, who was claiming the Gospels were just myths. They also went after guys like Friedrich Schleiermacher, arguing that faith had to be based on the hard facts of Scripture, not just on our own subjective human feelings. So what happens when you combine these deeply traditional Calvinist beliefs with the most cutting-edge European research methods of the day? Well, you get something really powerful and something uniquely American: a new synthesis.
They developed something they proudly called scientific theology. See, in an age where the natural sciences were getting all this prestige and authority, they wanted to show that theology could be just as rigorous, just as systematic, and just as based on hard evidence.
And their method was incredibly systematic. So, step 1, you treat the Bible like a scientist treats the natural world. It's your source of raw, objective facts. Step 2, you use the inductive method, which they borrowed from the scientific revolution, to gather and sort these facts without bias. Step 3, you apply those high-powered German philological tools to make sure you're interpreting every single word correctly. And then, step 4, you arrange all that evidence into a logical system. And for them, this scientific process always led to one conclusion, that traditional Calvinist doctrine was true. The result of all this was this incredible and really influential hybrid. The conclusions were rock-solid traditional Calvinism, but the methods they used to get there, they were totally modern and international, borrowing the most advanced scholarly tools from the very European thinkers they were so often arguing against. So let's circle all the way back to where we started. The popular image of Old Princeton as this isolated American fortress looking only to Scotland for its ideas, it just doesn't hold up to the evidence. The real picture is of an institution that was a major player in a global conversation, an institution that was not afraid to dive right into the most challenging ideas of its day and take them on head-on. And this whole story leaves us with a pretty powerful question to think about. It shows how a deeply American intellectual movement was actually the product of this huge global dialogue. And it kind of forces us to ask ourselves, which of the ideas that we think of as completely our own today are actually being shaped by these hidden conversations and unseen influences from all around the world?